The chill that morning was more intense than usual, the type that seeps deep into your bones and your memories. Walt Granger stood by the kitchen window of his Montana ranch, gazing out at the frozen landscape as the first faint light brushed the mountain peaks. Steam no longer rose from the coffee in his cup. It had gone cold, just as it did every morning now. The mug was Emma's, white ceramic with faded wildflowers and a tiny chip on the rim. Walt held it anyway, even though he rarely took a sip. Holding it made the quiet house feel a little less hollow. Emma had been gone for 4 months. Cancer took her in October, right when the aspen leaves turned to gold. She fought for 2 long years, and in the end, that fight left her weary but still gentle. Walt had held her hand upstairs in their bedroom as she slipped away. She squeezed his fingers once and whispered something he never quite caught. When he leaned closer, she was already gone. Since that moment, the silence in the house had grown thick and heavy, pressing in on him day after day. The Granger ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, 140 acres of rolling foothills and pine-covered slopes. Walt's grandfather cleared the first fields with horses and sheer will. His father built the barn and grew the cattle business. Walt himself carried it through droughts, debt, and harsh winters. Now at 72 he carried it alone. The kids were grown and gone. Michael lived in Seattle, Sarah in Denver. They called sometimes, but phone calls weren't the same as having company. Walt set the mug down gently and pulled on his heavy work coat, the one that smelled of hay, leather, and old diesel. Outside, the temperature hovered around 15 degrees. Snow covered the land like a pristine white blanket, untouched except for his own boot prints. He stepped onto the porch and headed toward the barn, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The horses greeted him with soft, familiar sounds. Shadow and Dusty were old like him, steady and quiet. Walt moved through the morning chores by habit. Hay, water, a hand on each warm neck. Animals were easier than people. They didn't ask questions or expect explanations. After the horses, he broke the ice in the cattle trough and scattered feed. The cows moved slowly, dark shapes against the bright snow. He counted them without thinking, all present. When he turned back toward the house, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, just outside the front gate, sat an enormous dog. It was massive, easily over 100 pounds, with a thick coat of grey and black fur that made it look almost like a wolf. It sat perfectly still in the snow, calm and patient, watching the ranch house as if it had been waiting a very long time. Walt narrowed his eyes against the bright glare and took a cautious step forward. The dog did not move. Walt approached slowly, a lifetime of ranch life teaching him how to read an animal's intent. This one wasn't aggressive. There was no tension in its body, no fear, just a quiet, watchful attention. As Walt got closer, he noticed a red bandana tied around the dog's neck, and something was tucked beneath it. "Easy now," Walt said softly. The dog's tail gave one slow, gentle wag. Walt knelt down, ignoring the cold biting through his jeans, and reached out. The dog leaned forward and allowed the touch. Its fur was thick and warm. Walt untied the string beneath the bandana and unfolded the small piece of paper attached to it. The note was written in shaky pencil on cheap notebook paper. "Please take care of him. He's all I had, that was all. No name, no explanation." Walt read it again, his throat tightening. 7 simple words, heavy with meaning. Someone had loved this dog deeply. Someone had lost everything else. Walt looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at him with dark, steady eyes. Something inside Walt cracked open. He knew that feeling. The feeling of loving something so completely that letting go was unbearable. "Come on," Walt said quietly. He stood and opened the gate. The dog rose and followed him without a moment's hesitation, walking close at his side as if it already belonged there. Inside the house, Walt filled a large bowl with water. The dog drank slowly. Then Walt opened the refrigerator and placed some leftover roast beef on a plate. The dog ate carefully, not rushed, not desperate. When it finished, it sat and looked at Walt, calm and grateful. Walt sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the note still in his hand. The house felt different now, less empty. The dog walked over and rested its massive head against Walt's knee. Walt's hand moved without thought, scratching behind its ears. "What am I supposed to call you?" Walt murmured. The dog's tail thumped once. Walt studied the animal. There was something wise about it. Steady, quiet, strong in a gentle way, it reminded him of the mountains themselves. "Timber," Walt said, "that suits you." Timber's tail thumped again. That night Timber lay by the wood stove while Walt sat in his chair pretending to read. He couldn't focus on the words. His thoughts kept returning to the note, to the person who wrote it, and to the kind of pain that would make someone trust their whole world to a stranger. Over the next few days, Timber settled into the ranch as if he had always been there. He followed Walt during chores, waited patiently by the barn, and rested near the fire each evening. He seemed to know when to stay close and when to give space. Walt found himself talking again, filling the silence he once feared. On the third evening, Walt noticed something beneath Timber's thick fur. A leather collar, old and worn, hidden under the bandana. Walt unclasped it and turned it over in the firelight. Carved into the leather were letters and a date, JC 2019. Walt stared at it for a long moment. Someone named JC had owned this dog. Someone who loved him enough to prepare for the end. Someone who had chosen Walt Granger for a reason he did not yet understand. Walt placed the collar and the note side by side on the table. Questions filled his mind. Who was JC? Why him? How had this dog found its way here in the dead of winter? Timber came and rested his head on Walt's knee again. "I'll find out," Walt said quietly. "I promise." Outside, the Montana winter held the land in a deep silence. But inside the old farmhouse, a grieving cowboy and a giant dog sat together, bound by a stranger's final act of love. And for the first time in months, Walt Granger felt something stir in his chest. Not peace, but purpose. 3 days passed and Timber never left Walt's side. Each morning the big dog followed him through the frozen yard, waited quietly while Walt fed the horses, and walked beside him as he checked the cattle. Timber did not run ahead or lag behind. He stayed close and steady, as if he already understood the rhythm of ranch life. The house felt warmer too, not just from the fire but from the quiet presence of another living soul. Walt told himself he was only keeping the dog until he found where he belonged. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. Timber already belonged here, or perhaps Walt belonged to him. One evening, while the wind rattled the windows, Walt sat at the kitchen table, studying the collar and the note again. JC, just 2 letters and a date. Someone had carved them carefully, as if they truly mattered. Walt wondered what kind of man or woman took the time to mark a collar like that. Someone patient, someone who planned ahead. "He was loved," Walt said aloud. Timber lifted his head and looked at him. The next morning, Walt decided to drive into Millerville. He needed supplies and he needed answers. He loaded Timber into the passenger seat of his old truck. The dog sat upright, head out the window, the snow-dusted wind rushing through his fur as if he had done it 100 times before. Millerville was small and quiet, the kind of town where everyone noticed when something changed. Walt parked outside the sheriff's office and left Timber in the truck with the window cracked. Inside, Deputy Karen Mills looked up from her desk and offered a soft smile. "Walt," she said, "good to see you." He nodded and placed the collar on the counter. "Found a dog at my gate, a big one, had this on him." Karen examined the leather, then the note. Her face grew serious as she read. "That handwriting looks weak," she observed. "Could be someone sick or elderly." "That's what I thought," Walt replied. "Any missing persons reports, any missing dogs." Karen checked the files, nothing recent, no missing dogs either. She set the collar down carefully. "You think whoever owned him is gone?" she asked quietly. Walt nodded. "Feels that way." Karen agreed to make some calls to check county records for recent deaths. It might take some time. Walt thanked her and left. At the feed store, Jim Morrison rang up Walt's purchases and eyed the giant bag of dog food. "Didn't know you had a dog," Jim said. "Didn't either," Walt replied. He showed Jim the collar. "These initials mean anything to you?" Jim shook his head slowly. Can't say they do, but I'll ask around. On the drive home, Walt passed the old cemetery on the hill. He slowed, then stopped without meaning to. Emma was buried there. He hadn't been back since the funeral. Timber shifted beside him, sensing the weight of the moment. Not today, Walt murmured and drove on. That night the phone rang. It was Sarah. They spoke carefully at first, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. She asked how he was doing. He said, fine. Then he told her about Timber. A dog, she said, surprised. Dad, that's good. They talked longer than usual. When they hung up, Walt realized he felt a little less alone. Days passed. Timber became part of everything. Walt cooked real meals again. He talked more, he slept better, but the mystery of JC stayed heavy in his thoughts. One evening, as Walt cleaned out a closet, a photograph slipped from an old coat pocket. Walt picked it up and froze. It was him and Emma, decades younger, standing in front of the barn during its construction. Emma wore one of his flannel shirts and held a hammer. They were smiling, full of life and plans for the future. Walt sat on the floor holding the photo, memories rushing in. Timber pressed against his side, warm and solid. I miss her, Walt whispered. The grief came hard and sudden. Tears fell freely. Timber stayed close, steady, letting Walt lean on him until the storm passed. Later that night, Deputy Karen Mills called. Walt, she said, I found something. A man named Joseph Carver, 78 years old. Lived alone near Bear Grass Creek. Died of heart failure about 6 weeks ago. No next of kin. No dog was found at the scene, but dog bowls and a leash were there. Walt felt his chest tighten. JC, he said. Karen gave him directions to the cabin. The next morning, Walt loaded Timber into the truck and drove toward the hills. The road was rough and narrow, packed with snow and utterly silent. Timber grew alert as they climbed, his eyes fixed ahead. When the small cabin came into view, Timber let out a soft sound and pressed closer to the window. Inside, the cabin was clean and simple. One room, a wood stove, a bed near the fire, dog bowls by the door. Photographs lined the walls. Every photo showed Timber. As a puppy, as a young dog in summer and in winter, always beside a man Walt did not recognize. On the table sat a leather-bound journal. Walt hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting matched the note. Joseph Carver wrote about the mountains, about solitude, about a pain in his chest, about knowing his time was coming. Then Walt reached the final entries. Carver wrote about Timber, about training him, about loving him, and about choosing Walt Granger. I've watched him from afar, one entry read. He works his land the right way, treats his animals well, lost his wife. He understands grief. Walt's hands shook as he read the last page. I sent Timber to him today, told him to go to Walt. He looked back once. That was enough. Walt closed the journal and sat in silence. Timber curled up on his old bed by the stove, his eyes soft with memory. You walked 15 miles, Walt said quietly. For him, Timber's tail thumped once. Walt understood now. This wasn't a coincidence. This was trust, a dying man's final act of love. Walt stood in the quiet cabin and spoke aloud. I've got him, he's safe. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. And for the first time since Emma's death, Walt felt something settle in his heart. He was no longer just surviving. He was carrying something forward, and he would not let it fall. Walt did not sleep much that night. Back at the ranch, he sat at the kitchen table with Joseph Carver's journal open beside Emma's old mug. Timber lay at his feet, breathing slow and steady. Walt read the final pages again and again, letting the words settle into him. Joseph Carver had not sent Timber away out of fear. He had sent him away out of love. He had trusted Walt with the one thing that mattered most to him. That kind of trust changed a man. The next morning, Walt drove back into town and went straight to the cemetery. He stood before Emma's grave for a long time, Timber sitting quietly beside him. The wind moved through the pine trees, soft and steady. I wasn't ready before, Walt said, but I am now. He told her everything about Timber, about Joseph Carver, about the journal, about how another man's final act had pulled him back from the edge. He pressed Emma's wedding ring gently into the snow at the base of her headstone. not as a goodbye but as a promise. I'm going to keep living, he said, for both of us. When he stood, his knees ached but his chest felt lighter. A few days later, Deputy Karen Mills called again. "Walt," she said, "you should come by the office. We found something else." At the sheriff's office, Karen spread old photographs across the table. One showed two young soldiers in uniform, arms around each other, smiling wide. Walt's breath caught. One of them was his father, the other was Joseph Carver. On the back of the photo were faded words. "Rick and Joe fought Bennying 1963. Karen explained they had served together. Same training unit, same war, brothers long before either man came to Montana. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Joseph Carver had not chosen Walt by chance. He had chosen the son of the man he trusted most in the world. Back at the ranch, Walt sat in his father's old chair holding the photo. Timber rested his head on Walt's knee. "My father never talked about the war," Walt said, "but he kept his promises. Always." That night, Walt called Michael, then Sarah. He told them the whole story, about his grandfather, about Joseph Carver, about Timber. There was silence on the line when he finished. "That's legacy, Dad," Michael finally said. "That's what lasts." Sarah drove up that weekend. Together they visited Emma's grave. They cried, they talked, they stood beside each other instead of apart. Timber stayed close, a quiet bridge between past and present. Spring came slowly, as it always does in Montana. Snow melted into mud, new calves were born, the land breathed again. Walt built a simple wooden marker for Joseph Carver and placed it beside his father's grave. A small sign, a quiet honor, two friends finally reunited. Life did not suddenly become easy. Grief did not vanish, but it softened. It became something Walt could carry instead of something that crushed him. Timber grew gray around the muzzle, but his eyes stayed wise and calm. He followed Walt every day just as he always had. Two old souls walking the same ground, keeping each other steady. One evening, Walt sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the mountains. Timber rested his head on Walt's knee, the same way he had on that first frozen morning. "Your person trusted me," Walt said softly, "and I won't waste that." The sky filled with stars. The ranch was quiet, not empty, just peaceful. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is learning to trust after you've lost everything. And sometimes healing arrives on four legs, with a note tied to its collar asking you to believe. If this story touched your heart, do us a favor, hit that like button. It helps more people find tales like this. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope often comes in unexpected forms. And don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the next story of quiet courage and second chances.